at 1 Samuel 18. We are picking up practically in verse 12 where we left off last week. So in 1 Samuel chapter 18, after the story of David and the account of David and Goliath, we noted that in this chapter, one of the bigger themes of this chapter is how David increases in his popularity really at the same time that Saul is losing his popularity among the people. One of the first individuals that we see David essentially win over to his side that Saul loses is what individual at the beginning of chapter 18? Jonathan, right? We learn how the friendship that develops between Jonathan and David is established, and he's the first individual that basically David's able to win over from Saul, which becomes a lot clearer in chapter 19, as we'll talk about hopefully next week. After that, we understand that Saul becomes extremely jealous of David. We talked about that after the death of Goliath and after David's success really up to this point, the people are singing the praises of David, attributing to him a lot of great things compared to Saul. And Saul becomes jealous of David for this. And in chapter 18, verse 10, we saw where Saul tries to take David's life, right? He takes a javelin and essentially tries to, use that as an object to throw at him and basically like basically to pierce him and to kill him. But David escapes out of that. So one thing that we'll note tonight, we're going to try to go down from verses 12 down through verse 28. One thing that you want to think about when you're looking at this section of 1 Samuel is what Saul's fear motivates him to do. Now, we know that in the Bible, there are occasions where it talks about one of the things that a Christian needs is fear. Not in the sense that we're going to talk about it with Saul, but fear in the sense of respect. The book of Proverbs talks about on multiple occasions the good things that come from having a healthy fear of God. And Saul, on the other hand, his fear is not more so motivated out of a respect of God, but Saul's fear really stems from the fact that he is apart from God. And that's going to lead him to do a lot of different things, really beginning in this chapter, but certainly moving forward when it came to his relationship with David. And that's something that we want to keep in mind, what Saul's fear does concerning his relationship to David. Now, in verses 12 through 16, this section of the chapter is really going to note how at this point David wins over the people of Israel. And at the same time, there's probably less of a connection between Saul and the people. David wins over the people of Israel. So we begin in verse 12. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him and was departed from Saul. So one thing that we're going to note that's a little bit different at this point is that Saul beforehand, before he tried to kill David in verses 10 through 11, it just indicated that he was jealous. He was very angry, he was very jealous at David, but because of David's ability to escape, and as verse 12 indicates, the fact that the Lord was with him and not with Saul, this turns Saul's anger into fear. And this type of fear that Saul has typically leads to people making a lot of poor decisions. Now, going forward in verses 12 through 28, while Saul had tried to directly kill David in terms of, just being blunt and being direct about it, Saul's going to try to maneuver his way around to get David killed, but sort of remove his own hands from shedding the blood, as we'll see going forward. And I will note one other thing to keep in mind. You think about Saul's fear, what it motivated him to do. Another thing you want to keep in mind is David's unwavering loyalty to Saul, despite what Saul tries to do to him. That's going to be something that comes up over and over again as we move forward with their relationship with one another. So verse 13, Saul removed David from him and made him his captain over 1,000, and he went out and came in before the people. So Saul notices that David is afraid of David. And so Saul's natural response is, get him out of the court, or get him out of my presence. Give him another job where he's not going to be around me that much at all. And Saul's mindset is, well, and what would have appeared to the common person is that how we're going to get Saul out, or how we're going to get David out of my presence is just give him a promotion. Again, verse 13, he promoted him essentially to be a captain over 1,000. And so nobody would have thought anything poor of this. David is from what we can tell at this point, but certainly later on in the chapter, he's a pretty well-liked guy, a pretty successful guy. It makes sense to give him a promotion because of what he's produced, especially in light of chapter 17. So that seems like a very good promotion. But we're going to note verse 14 and down through verse 16. You get the reason why Saul does this, and it's not for a good cause at all. You note verse 13 that he went out and came in before the people, which is just sort of noting that he had a greater activity. So Saul's fear was of David, and so Saul made the decision, I'll get David out of my sight by putting him as a captain over 1,000. Well, what this does is that now David has more of a visible face in front of the soldiers of the Israelites. He has a more visible face in front of the people because he's now interacting with them. Rather than being stuck maybe in Saul's court where he's only around them, Saul's decision here is going to help increase David's popularity. And Saul, it's going to backfire on Saul. That'll come up over and over again. Saul's plans backfiring on one another. If you think about the idea of being a captain over 1,000, if you think about within our own nation's history, we know that when it comes to gaining prestige or gaining popularity, a lot of times great well-known men within our own country got prestige by their service on the battlefield, right? You think about George Washington. One of the qualities that made him an attractive option to being the first president of the United States was his success on the battlefield. President Grant, right? Civil War. You think about Dwight Eisenhower in World War II. All of those men they gained a lot of popularity because of their service on the battlefield. That's sort of what happens here with David. He's going to gain service on the battlefield. Now, a point of application that we'll note, well, let's go down through verses 14 and 16, then we'll come back to that. All right, so David behaved himself wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. Wherefore, when Saul saw that he behaved himself very wisely, he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he went out and came in before him. So naturally, David did that which is right. We know back in chapter 16, David was a man that essentially was after God's own heart. Saul might have thought that David being in the public sphere, maybe he makes a mistake and ruins his reputation. Maybe he loses popularity because he's not a very capable person. Maybe that's why Saul thought to himself to put him in this position. You know, if you put a person in a position of leadership and he fails, that generally is going to bring a lot of negative attention on that individual. I'll just mention this briefly, but the football coach at Tennessee, the same thing sort of happened to him if you've been watching the news with how that ended. Certainly he's fired now, but he's probably going to have a hard time getting a job moving forward. But, you know, if you don't respond well when you're put in charge of something, that really hurts your perception among people. Maybe that's what Saul's thinking, but David, as verse 14 says, he says that he behaved himself wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. He was successful, not just because he's a great person, but obviously because God's favor was on him. So by verse 15, Saul saw that he behaved himself very wisely. He was afraid of him. His plans have backfired. And so Saul is going to is sort of left figuring out, you know, what's going to be another plan to try to undermine David. One thing that I'll point out about the word afraid, verse 15. All right, so if you have the King James version of the Bible, if you note in verse 12 and verse 15, the text states that Saul was afraid, right? Verse 12, Saul was afraid of David at the very beginning of that verse. You look at the end of verse 15, it says that Saul was afraid of him. Now, I'm not sure about other translations, but there are actually two different words here that are translated as afraid that we probably don't pick up on unless we are looking at another translation or we're looking at the actual Hebrew word. The word in verse 15 is a lot stronger indication of fear. We might say it's the difference between being afraid versus being terrified. That's the indication of the word there in verse 15. So the thought is that now that this plan has failed, verse 14, Saul's in a worse position, at least in terms of being afraid. He's a lot worse off than he was before this had happened, because his plan had been undermined. So you kind of get that indication if you look at the word. But you know verse 16, the end result of it, right? David wins over the people of Israel. All of Israel and Judah love David. We know David was of the tribe of Judah. It makes sense why people of Judah would love him. But you know that all Israel loved David. Even the people of Saul's tribe of Benjamin, they loved David as well, because he did well and God's favor was with him. And again, that all points out, verse 16, because he went out and came in before them. David's been successful in front of a lot of different people. He's gained a lot of respect in front of these people. So David's public presence gives him great popularity versus Saul, who the indication is not out in front of the people like David is. So David has won over the people by verse 16. Now the point of application when you think about this, it comes from, again, what Saul does out of his fear. You see, Saul's fear, because he was wrong with God, it motivated him to try to separate himself from the people of God. And you see that verse 12, because we know that God's favor was with David, but yet Saul, who at this point was terrified for all the wrong reasons, Saul was trying to do everything in his power to separate himself from David, who was a man of God. Sometimes that's what fear, whenever we do things that are wrong, it causes us to do. And I think this also shows an important reason why assembling is important, right? Because we understand that, we understand the importance about being around other Christians, right? Being around other people. You wonder if Saul had the right attitude and kept David around, that would have changed Saul's attitude about his entire situation, right? Having a godly man giving him advice and things like that. Maybe that changed Saul's life for the better if Saul had done that. Likewise, I think about that when it comes to us as Christians. One of the reasons why we assemble together as Christians is obviously to worship God, because we're commanded to do that. That's certainly true, but we also talk about the need to edify, the need to encourage one another. We can't do that if we separate ourselves from other people or other children of God, right? We can't encourage one another if we don't have any contact with each other. And so I think that's something to think about. If Saul had not tried to put the man of God, at least in the form of David, away from him, maybe his life changes and it would have ended a lot better. Likewise, we as Christians don't need to make that same mistake. We don't need to try to burn the bridges, so to speak, with our relationships with the people of God, because that's only going to backfire on us, just like it did for Saul. And I know Brother Wayne's mentioned this a lot in Bible class, in lessons a lot. Psalm chapter 122, verse 1, David makes a remark, "I was glad when they said unto me, let us go into the house of the Lord." David, in that, if you go and read through that chapter, you see how David understood the importance of being in the house of God, because that's where the people of God gathered. And I often think, when he was writing that chapter or writing that song, perhaps he thought about Saul's mistake, trying to remove himself from David, the man of God, and how that turned out for Saul. But that's something that I think we can think about in that section. Are there any comments that you'd like to add on to verses 12 through 16?
I don't think Saul realized it, but in fighting David, he was really fighting God.
Right.
It's like Paul or Saul in the New Testament. The Lord encountered him. You're kicking against the pricks. In other words, you're fighting the very cause you think you're promoting, and so fighting against the man of God, in essence, you're fighting God.
that brings to mind, where is it? I can't remember the chapter, but it's in the book of Acts where the Jews are trying. I think it was Peter and John that they were trying to persecute, and then I believe it was Gamaliel that got up and said, if what they're doing is the work of God, how can we stop it? Right? It doesn't make sense to, if in that passage is talking about if what Peter and John were doing, if it was not from God, it would be halted somewhere or another. But if it was from God, then there's nothing that we can do to stop it. And that passage rings true. That's the same idea there, right? It didn't matter what Saul did. Even though he was trying to attack David, trying to fight against God was never going to work out for him. Fortunately, Saul didn't realize that. All right, so verses 17 through 19, right? Maybe Saul tried to get David's popularity to tank, maybe because he would make some mistakes. Doesn't happen by verse 16. So Saul's going to try to get David to essentially die in battle in verses 17 down through the end of the chapter, and he's going to do that by the promise of marriage. Verse 17, Saul said to David, "Behold, my elder daughter Merab, her will I give thee to wife. Only be thou valiant for me, and fight the Lord's battles." For Saul said, "Let not mine hand be upon him, but let the hand of the Philistines be upon him." Now, if you remember, back in chapter 17, verse 25, one of the things that was said that would be given to the man that defeated Goliath was that the king would give him his daughter in marriage. That was, again, 1 Samuel 17, verse 25. Now, whether Saul actually made that statement or not, that was seen as the payment for defeating Goliath, but yet Saul's going to add on a little bit more here, what David has to do. Thinking about this passage, I will mention Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 5. One of the requirements under the law of Moses is that a man that was newly wed was able to get out of military service for a year. So Saul may try to use this as a motive to get David to marry his daughter, not just because of it being the king's daughter, but also he would get a year out of military service. But Saul's going to make David fight beforehand. So Saul makes sure, David, you've got to keep fighting on for Merab. And again, this is Saul's first daughter. Again, you would think that this is maybe a noble thing that Saul's doing, but the end of verse 17 gives the indication. Saul said, "Let not mine hand be upon him, but let the hand of the Philistines be upon him." So you want to note that there at the end of verse 17, what does Saul do when he says, "Let not mine hand be upon him, but let the hand of the Philistines be upon him"?
He's trying to escape any thought of responsibility being on him. He's passing the buck to God. In other words,
Right.
It's going to look bad if he does it. I mean,
Right.
he himself, and everybody loves him.
Yep.
But if the Philistines accidentally or on purpose kill him, well, that's just the way war is.
Yeah, so by verse 17, David's a very popular fellow. It's not like Saul can just order him to be killed and think that will go over very well. So what Saul decides to do is he's going to get him to die at the hand of the Philistines. He's going to get him to fight against the Philistines, and that way he dies in battle. And so really, as Brother Wayne was saying, Saul's trying to remove any type of connection back to him, that he was responsible for David's death. Now, who does this? David does the exact same thing with Uriah, right? He tries to wash his hand of it by getting the enemy to kill Uriah. Maybe this is where David gets this from, that strategy. Although it doesn't work for Saul, so it wouldn't make sense why David would want to do that with Uriah. Now, you know, verse 17, that Saul wanted David to fight the Lord's battles. I'll mention later on in this book, 1 Samuel chapter 25, verse 28, we encounter Nabal and Abigail, and one of the things that Abigail says to David is that one of the ways in which a man would become king is that he would fight the Lord's battles. And so I think that's interesting. Saul wants David to fight the Lord's battles, and yet the idea that Abigail had, and probably other Israelites had, is that the man who fought the Lord's battles had the right to be king. And so, obviously, David proves himself to be king in that way. So verse 18, David just responds with humility, right? David said unto Saul, who am I, and what is my life or my father's family in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king? David did not come from nobility. He was simply a shepherd. His mindset was, I don't have any right, I don't have any expectation to be able to marry the daughter of a king. Nevertheless, we see verse 19 that Merab is given away. But it came to pass at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, that she was given unto Adriel the Mahalathite to wife. Now, we're not specifically told here, but the indication is that, as we'll see later on by verse 23, the indication is that David actually went forth and fought against the Philistines. That was his job. So verse 19, when it came to pass, at the time when David would have married Merab, Saul's whole goal was to get David to die in battle, but it had not worked. And so what Saul decides to do is he just gives Merab to another man. So that way David could not marry Merab. And that plays a role going forward, because David's going to use the same strategy with another one of his daughters. And so David, the indication is he fulfilled what Saul required, but Saul goes behind his back and gives Merab over to another man. Now I'll note that in 2 Samuel 21 verse 8, you read about what happens to the sons of Adriel and Merab, and it doesn't end pretty. Their sons, I believe they had 5 of them, but they all were killed in 2 Samuel chapter 21. So her sons did not meet a great end. So the first daughter doesn't work. Verses 20 through 28, Saul's going to try the exact same thing, but this time with Michal. Verse 20, Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David, and they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. This is basically, as we're going to see down through verse 20, verse 26. This is what we might say in this particular situation. The situation is exactly right, in the sense that Michal actually has an affectionate attitude towards David. We're not told that about Merab, but when it came to Michal, Michal loved David. So Jonathan, Saul's lost Jonathan. Jonathan loves David as a friend. The people of Israel, David has won over. Now David's going to win over one of Saul's daughters. And that's, again, you're seeing that theme throughout this chapter, how David continually is winning over different people within Israel from Saul's grasp. Now, this is one thing that we might reveal about Saul's character. We've mentioned this before when we talked about there at the very beginning with Saul, that apparently Saul's father cared for him a lot. Saul had been worried about what his father was thinking when Saul and his servant had went out to find Saul's father's donkey, right? And Saul knew that his father would be concerned with him. But if you look at the actions of Saul as a parent, that it seems a lot different than what his father did. Because really in these verses with the 2 daughters, all Saul is doing is using his daughters as a pawn in a way to try to bring about the downfall of David. And I think that reveals a lot about the character of Saul at this point. The way that he uses his daughters, he's not necessarily concerned about, them marrying and their spiritual state after it. He's only concerned about how the marriage of his daughters, or the potential marriage of his daughters, can bring about the downfall of David. And I think when you think about the actions of Saul here, it shows a father that's really not a very good father at all. Now, it is interesting to note that Saul's going to use Michal. Verse 21, Saul said, I will give David her, that she may be a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Wherefore Saul said to David, Thou shalt this day be my son-in-law in the one of the twain. Now Saul says here that Michal shall be a snare to David. Now what's interesting to note is that in 1 Samuel chapter 19 verse 11, we perhaps talk about that next week. It's actually going to be Michal that actually saves David's life. So a little bit of irony there. Saul thought that David's love for Michal would bring about his downfall, when in reality Michal is going to be one of the individuals that preserves David from dying in 1 Samuel chapter 19. The snare, of course, is that David, because of his great love for Michal, is going to be willing to do whatever Saul says, which includes going into battle against the Philistines. And that's the snare, right? It's not because she wants to deceive David. It's just that David's love for her would cause him to go and die in battle. That's Saul's idea. And that ending phrase there, thou shalt this day be my son-in-law in the one of the twain, just a way that indicates immediate. Just a way to indicate that Saul wants this done immediately or as quick as possible. Certainly because of David's popularity. So, verse 22, Saul tells his servants to relay this message to David. Saul commanded his servants, saying, commune with David secretly, and say, behold, the king hath delight in thee, and all his servants love thee. Now therefore be the king's son-in-law. Saul's servants spake those words in the ears of David, and David said, seemeth it to you a light thing to be a king's son-in-law, seeing that I am a poor man and lightly esteemed? Now you know, this time Saul does not go and tell David this himself, whereas he did that in verse 17. This time, in relaying this message, Saul actually does this through his servants. Perhaps at this point, David does not trust Saul to a certain extent. Certainly if David had gone out and fulfilled everything necessary to marry Merab in verse 17 through verse 19, and still didn't get her, right? David probably doesn't have a lot of faith that Saul's going to back up what he says. So Saul sends his servants this time, and more than likely, David had served in Saul's court. He probably knew the servants of Saul, and more than likely had a good relationship with them. After all, verse 16 said that all Israel and Judah loved David. So he's probably got a very good relationship with them. Probably they are trustworthy to David. David simply argues again, verse 23, that it's not very easy to become the son-in-law of the king. And the hang-up here, the concern is about the dowry to be paid. Generally, when it came to the dowry, the groom would have to make the payment towards the father in order to marry the daughter. And obviously, if your daughter came from nobility, you had to pay a lot of money. Genesis chapter 25, for instance, this is not the case of a king, as far as I'm aware of, but Genesis chapter 25, you read about what was given to Rebekah, the wife of Isaac, when the servant went to go meet with I wrote down the wrong passage, I believe, but if you go back and you read, let's see if I can find that real quick. Yeah, it's in Genesis chapter 24, but if you read, one thing you'll note about that is how much a lot of goods, a lot of wealth was taken to offer to Rebekah's father, because it was expected that the groom would make a payment to the father in order to be able to marry the bride. And that reminds me, Dad, do you care to share how much Bryant had to pay in order to
disclose that?
Dad said he's not going to disclose that.
Still working on that figure.
Still working on that figure, okay. Obviously, people don't do that today, but worth a shot to see if he gave me something in that as well. Apparently not. So, David likewise understands, again, this is the king's daughter. It's going to take a lot of money to be able to pay the dowry to be able to marry her. And verse 23, he ends this statement by saying, I am a poor man and lightly esteemed. The lightly esteemed there probably referred to David recognizing Saul's attitude towards him based on what happened verses 17 through 19. If David was willing to go through all of that in those verses, and Saul was still not willing to give his daughter to David in marriage, David probably, in his mind, did not think that Saul had a high opinion of him. And that's the importance there of the lightly esteem. But verse 24, the servants of Saul told him, saying, On this manner spake David. And Saul said, Thus shall ye say to David, The king desireth not any dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines to be avenged of the king's enemies. But Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. So again, the motive is given there at the end of verse 25. The servants reported what David said back to Saul. Saul, verse 25, is just reassuring David. He doesn't look for any type of financial dowry, but he gives David rather a payment that David would have known very well, being a man of war. Now, the father often had the right to determine what type of payment he would receive. If you want to put in your Bible, Genesis 34 is a good example of that, where Shechem acknowledges that Jacob had the right to require any type of payment for Shechem to be able to marry Dinah. Now, the importance here, we talked about sometimes how the heads of enemies were seen as trophies. You know, obviously you have that here, but you also have proof that these are Philistines that David killed because of what David takes away from them. This is something that is not unique to that time. We're told that one of the Egyptian pharaohs ordered his soldiers to take the same object of the Libyans, who actually practiced circumcision. But the Philistines did not practice circumcision. Saul knew that. David knew that. Thus, Saul had a way to know that David actually killed the Philistines because of what they took from them. That's just the reason why that is mentioned there. So verse 26, David recognizes this is an acceptable agreement. It pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law, and the days were not expired. So David arose and went, he and his men, and slew of the Philistines 200 men. And David brought their foreskins, and they gave them in full tale to the king, that he might be the king's son-in-law. And Saul gave him Michal his daughter to wife. And Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. So once again, Saul's plan to have David killed backfires on him. David actually goes and probably lives up to his reputation. He's a well-respected man because he goes and does more above and beyond what Saul had required of him. So David is able to marry Michal, and by verse 29, Michal's love and affection was certainly much more directed at David than it was at her father Saul. So, by verse 29, Saul was yet the more afraid of David, and Saul became David's enemy continually. And that sets forth the rest of this book, where you're going to constantly see tension between Saul and David. All of this spurred not because of David's immorality, but because Saul, who was not willing to be right in the sight of God, his fear of David, who was right in the sight of God, motivated that animosity between the two, but more so directed from Saul towards David rather than from David to Saul. And you look at this, and you constantly think about this as we move forward. How many times that Saul had David at the point where he was going to kill him. Not just David able to overcome and escape those situations, but how many times David maintained his loyalty towards Saul. Shows that David really is a man of integrity based on that. And paints David, obviously, as a much better person at this point in his life than what Saul was. So that's something to think about as we move forward. The fear of Saul in a negative light contrasted to the positive, which is over and over again David's loyalty towards the king of Israel. Well, that being said, we're going to go ahead and stop here tonight. We'll pick up verse 30 sort of connects with the section in chapter 19, so we'll pick up there next week. Again, thank you for your time, and thank you for your attention this evening.